Hello everyone. So today I'm going to introduce you to cognitive psychology, and we will discuss what cognitive psychology is and why you should study it. And we will also go over the evolution of cognitive psychology or its historical journey to this day. Right. So cognitive psychology is basically a discipline within psychology, or a subfield of psychology, which is concerned with looking at how the mind is organized in producing intelligent thought and secondly how the brain is realized in the mind. Now let's really try to dissect what this means, right? So firstly, when we look at the first bit of the definition of cognitive psychology, and we say that it's the study of how the mind is organized in producing intelligent thought, right? So we're basically looking at the organization of the mind, which is, the mind is basically an abstract notion, right? The brain is the physical structure that we have, right? So we're looking at the organization of mental activity here, right? Our thought processes. And we'll see a lot of that as we go along, right? And we're looking at this organization in the context of producing intelligent thought, right? So if someone is solving a problem, what are the steps that they're taking in order to reach whatever conclusion that they are reaching? So steps during problem solving, right? So that's one of the things that cognitive psychology will concern itself with, right? And then if you're looking at, how memory works, one of the ways that you might be interested in that, looking at the working of memory, is looking at, retention of a particular amount of words in a given amount of time, right? So you're looking at, and you might also be interested in looking at how are these words organized in memory? How is this material organized? So again, you're looking at the organization of a mental process in, in displaying some form of intelligent thought, right? So that's the first bit of the definition. The second bit is how the brain is realized in the mind. And this is something that's very, very interesting, when we say how the brain, which is, the physical structure that we have, right, is realized in the mind. And this is a newer sort of addition to cognitive psychology, because here we're really looking at cognitive neuroscience, right? Because with advancements in science, right, and imaging techniques, for example, brain imaging techniques, right, it's become possible for us to really look at physical structures of the brain and how they may be influencing mental processes such as, or how they may be underlying rather, mental processes such as memory, such as perception, right, such as decision making, right, or language acquisition, right? So this is what it is that, this is what it means that, how the brain is realized in the mind. That's what it means that, how is the physical structure, what are the physical mechanisms that are underlying thought, perception, memory, and all of these different abstract processes that we refer to when we look at cognitive psychology, right? So this is basically what we start off with. And now that we have a particular definition, right, we come to the next question, which is that, who studies cognitive psychology and why study cognitive psychology? So the first response to this really is that, cognitive psychologists, the book puts forth this very interesting example in which it talks about how cognitive psychologists are, the tinkerers who are basically taking apart this clock to see how it works, right? Because, one of the reasons that you would want to study cognitive psychology is purely because you're a tinkerer, that you have this intellectual curiosity. You want to look at, the most interesting machine, perhaps, that there is, which is the human mind, and you're curious regarding its workings, right? So, that's one of the first reasons that you might have, which is intellectual curiosity, right? But then, obviously, there are other reasons as well, because what you see is that cognitive psychology really has a lot of implications, or research from cognitive psychology can be used for a lot of, for adding to our knowledge in a lot of different disciplines, right? Such as economics, right? Such as linguistics, right? Such as, for example, sociology. How so? You might ask, how can research from cognitive psychology be used in any useful way in economics or in linguistics or in sociology? Well, if you know something about the human mind, right, you can always say something about behavior. If you know how thought is going to be processed, how decisions are going to be made, then you can say something about how people would invest, right? What they would choose to buy and what they wouldn't choose to buy, right? So, that would have implications for economics, right? You have, cognitive psychology research can be used to study how language is acquired, right? And that obviously has implications for linguistics, right? How language is organized in the brain, right? That also has implications for linguistics, right? So language acquisition is something that I'll write here. And then sociology. So, for example, if you know how people think about groups and how they approach groups, right? Or, for example, how do they, what is their perception about different groups, and that perception colors their behavior in groups, right? So then that would have implications for sociology as well, right? So studying people in groups. And it's not just that, cognitive psychology and research in cognitive psychology only has implications for all of these academic fields, right? But cognitive psychology can have very real implications for your daily life, such as, if you want to know what is the best method to study so that you retain the most amount of information for a long time, right? Cognitive psychology and research within cognitive psychology can really help you narrow down, what the best method to study in order to maximize retention is, right? So, these are some of the reasons that someone might have to study cognitive psychology, right? But obviously, this list is not exhaustive. I'm sure that you guys can find me another reason, and that is something that we'll discuss in class. Anyway, so we've gone over what cognitive psychology is. We've looked at a brief definition. We've gone over why you might want to study cognitive psychology. Next, what we turn our attention to is the history of cognitive psychology. Right? Now, what happened within psychology, right? When psychology evolved as a discipline, right? So the person that we credit with giving birth or, sort of establishing psychology as a distinct discipline, who we term as the father of psychology, is Wilhelm Wundt, right? The reason for being, called the father of psychology, the reason that Wilhelm Wundt is called the father of psychology is because he was one of the first people who not only advocated for psychology to be a distinct discipline and not just be a subfield within philosophy or some other discipline, right, was because Wundt established the first psychology lab, right? So he established the lab, he started the first journal, and he made a huge contribution with that regard. Wilhelm Wundt, the sort of experiments that Wilhelm Wundt conducted in his lab were essentially cognitive psychology experiments, because he was looking at sensation, he was looking at perception. All of these topics are what we study within the realm of cognitive psychology today, right? But, his approach was very different to what we have today, right? Wilhelm Wundt was using a method that he called introspection, right? And introspection, the method, what it implied was that, for example, you were given a list of words, right? Now, these could be something like tree, berries, animals, pen, tent, and the research participant, right? They're sitting in a lab, right? And what they were asked to do was that they were asked to look at this word and read it, right? And the experimenter noted, the amount of time it took for them to respond. And the response that was asked of them was to, sort of list down any sort of mental imagery that came into their mind when they read this word, right? Or whatever came in their mind, whatever thoughts they had, whatever images they had, whatever sensations they had, they were to report all of these to the experimenter, right? Now, what Wundt was trying to do using this method and, these kind of experiments was that he was really following, what was the zeitgeist of the times. And he was trying to sort of break conscious experience down, because that was what he believed to be the subject matter of psychology. He was trying to break conscious experience down into its components, right? Very much like how in physics, researchers were trying to break down matter into its components. So Wundt was using the same sort of thinking, and what he was working with was the mind, right? Or what he was working with was thought, right? And he was trying to break thought down into what he believed were the different components of conscious experience. So Wundt believed that, the basic components of conscious experience were sensations, images, and feelings. Sorry about that. Right, and that's what he was trying to do. And it's said that Wundt believed that he would be able to create a periodic table of all of these different components of conscious experience, right? Now, this is very far from the sort of work that's done in cognitive psychology today, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to contextualize and sort of look at the journey that cognitive psychology has taken ever since the birth of psychology as a distinct discipline itself, right? Now, there were understandably a lot of problems with what Wundt was doing here, because a lot of times what happened was, and a lot of different labs reported this, that when participants were given all of these different words, right, they did not all, all the participants did not report on any sort of mental images, right? And this was a problem because, according to Wundt, images were a very important component of any sort of conscious experience. And when, introspection was failing in this regard, there came up questions regarding, firstly, the introspective method, and then how correct Wundt was with regards to what the components of conscious experience are, right? And another thing that started happening was that, every lab that was using introspection as its method had its own results, which always, right, seemed to come as proof for the theory that that particular lab was testing. So, introspection really became a method which was considered not very, it was perhaps, producing not very valid results, because every lab was producing the results that it wanted to see, right? And especially when psychology shifted from Germany, where it was conceived, to the United States, right, where it really came of age, right, what you see is that in the United States, introspection did not really gain a lot of momentum, because the spirit, again, the zeitgeist of the United States was very different. In the United States, you had a very, very prevalent, pragmatic style of doing things, right? You wanted to sort of look at psychology and really look at, what practical value can this discipline add to our lives, right? So can it have any application in terms of, education? Can it have any practical value in helping us better our lives, right? So that was really the spirit of the times in the United States, right? And in the United States, everyone was bent more towards a functionalist psychology, right? Because what we've seen is that, when we talk about Wundt and we talk about his followers and his tools, they were more of structuralists, right? Because they were concerned with the structure of conscious experience. Whereas in the United States, it was very different. It was that you were looking at the practical value of what this discipline could bring you. And there was more of a spirit, more people were following the functionalist school of thought, which was concerned more with, what the function of conscious experience is. And they were more inspired by the work of William James, right? I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with regards to the functionalist school of thought, but I'm going to move forward now towards what became the most powerful movement really in the United States, which is that of behaviorism, right, with the work of J.B. Watson. Now, behaviorism is usually considered the time when psychology lost its mind, right? And we use this term because, psychology did literally lose its mind, right? Because J.B. Watson did not believe in the methods of introspection at all, right? And he took it further, right? And, especially what we see with, B.F. Skinner's writings becoming popular is that, no reference to anything mental is allowed, right? Because with behaviorism, what you're doing is that you're studying only overt behavior. And hence, any reference to anything mental, right, has no longer any place in the study, in, the discipline of psychology, which has become the scientific study of behavior, right? Even though there were, certain movements such as Gestalt psychology, which was again mainly a German movement, but a lot of Gestalt psychologists moved to the United States as they fled from the Nazi regime from Germany, right? And Gestalt psychology had this very, very interesting sort of way of looking at perception and describing perception, in which they held that the sum, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And this can really be something that they were countering structuralism with as well, because when Wundt was trying to get at, all of these different components of conscious experience, right? So, he was trying to create the whole through the parts, right? But with Gestalt psychology, when they're asserting that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right? So then that is an attack on the structuralists, right? So with Gestalt psychology, in America, there were references to the mind and the brain and perception, but the behaviorists were very quick in shutting them down and critiquing them, because the behaviorists were very, very strong in this belief that psychology should not concern itself with anything that could not be observed directly, right? And therefore, it took the longest time, because of how supreme behaviorism reigned in the United States. It took a very long time before the cognitive revolution could happen, in the sense that when psychology regained or reclaimed its mind, right? So what we turn to next is looking at all of the different influences that brought about the return to cognitive psychology. Right, so the first of these is really that there came a need to study human performance, right? So during World War II, governments badly needed some sort of knowledge as to how to train soldiers and how to deal with very practical issues, such as, so they needed to train soldiers to really use this very technical equipment, and also needed knowledge in terms of how do they improve or how do they sort of prevent attention breakdowns during times of stress, right? Now, these were all very practical problems, and behaviorism did not really offer any kind of solution to these problems, right? So here, what we see is that we needed some psychologists, right? Or we needed some sort of system that would help us look at human performance, right? And later what happened was that when these psychologists went home from the war, even though the war had really demanded them to solve these very practical problems, some of these problems still stayed with them, right? And this research on human performance eventually evolved into this information processing research, in which what we do is, and that is something that's still relevant in cognitive psychology, that what's studied is how information is processing through the brain. And this is an abstract concept, in the sense that you're creating these flow charts in order to explain how information, which is an abstract concept in itself, is stored, and how it's sort of encoded how is it, what sort of operations, mental operations are performed on it, and then what exactly is the output. But we get to that later in the chapter as well. Yes, sorry, let me correct this. I wrote informating performance or something like that. But yes, this is also known as information theory, really. And this basically deals with how information is processed, right? Okay, so the second influence was all of the work in computer science, right? Which was really looking at the creation of artificial intelligence, right? And trying to simulate human intelligence in machines, right? Now, one thing that, artificial intelligence and cognitive psychologists or psychologists studying artificial intelligence really did was that it took away some of the inhibitions that these psychologists might have had in studying, the operations of the mind itself, when they could analyze intelligence in a machine or analyze different operations in a machine that might have made them more likely to study the mind itself, right? Because what we see is that, in the United States, for example, because of behaviorism, this was a trend which was not very, very mainstream, right? So yes, so that's one of the ways in which the creation of artificial intelligence really pushed psychologists to really, look at mental operations and the mind. And, the last influence that we're going to talk about is that of linguistics, right? And especially the work in linguistics by Noam Chomsky, right? Now, Chomsky his research with linguistics suggested that language structures and the acquisition of language is a lot more complicated than what the behaviorists would have us believe. So, with regards to behaviorism, there is really no explanation for how language is acquired except for reinforcement. And according to Chomsky, reinforcement is not sufficient to understand language acquisition, right? So, linguistics also offered, research in linguistics also offered a huge blow to behaviorism and, this redirection towards more cognitive processes in trying to understand the process of language acquisition and the complexity of mental operations that's involved in the acquisition of language, the storing of language, right, and all of the different operations that are associated with language. So that was another influence altogether. Now, next, what we see is that all of these different factors that we've considered, all of them sort of combined to form the information processing approach to studying human cognition. And that is something that I've sort of hinted at earlier as well. But basically, the information processing approach, what it does is that it tries to, describe certain steps that are involved in the analysis of what it calls information. So, this information can be anything, right? It might be, any sort of sensation that's coming in, but what you do is that you describe, how that information is processed in a series of steps, right? And these steps are completely mental in the sense that there may not be any sort of biological mechanism underlying these steps, but what they do is that they make us understand how information may be analyzed and what sort of operations may be happening on whatever information is incoming. So more on this in the next video.